She wore an emerald dress that cost her 3 months of savings, and they laughed at it. In a room full of diamonds and inherited money, one woman stood completely alone. Not because she was lost, because they made sure she felt that way. What nobody in that ballroom understood was this. The man in the corner, the one everyone was too afraid to look at directly, had been watching the whole time. And he remembered everything. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, stay until the end. Comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The dress had been hanging in Amara Bellamy's closet for 11 weeks before she finally wore it. She'd found it on a Tuesday afternoon at a small boutique on Clement Street, the kind of shop tucked between a dry cleaner and a dim sum place, the kind that didn't put prices on anything in the window. The emerald silk had caught the light in a way that made her stop walking. She stood on the sidewalk for almost a full minute before going inside, and even then she almost didn't try it on. The woman behind the counter had watched her with that particular kind of patience that isn't really patience at all. Just the waiting kind. The kind that says, I'll give you exactly 30 more seconds before I find something else to do. Amara had felt that look before. She'd felt it her whole life. She knew what it meant even when nobody said it out loud. But the dress fit. That was the thing that surprised her most. It didn't just fit. It settled against her body like it had always known her shape. Dark green against deep brown skin, the fabric moving when she moved, not fighting her, not apologizing for her. She stood in front of the fitting room mirror for a long moment, longer than she should have, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not beauty exactly. Something more complicated than that. She bought it. She didn't look at the price tag until she was already at the register, and by then it was too late to talk herself out of it. $342. Almost half a week's pay. She told herself she'd wear it somewhere. That was 11 weeks ago. The invitation to the Meridian Children's Fund Gala had come through Kim Jong's household, passed along by his assistant Hyun in the careful, expressionless way Hyun passed along everything. Amara's attendance wasn't exactly required. It wasn't exactly optional either. Minjun was going to be there. Kim insisted on it. Some image thing, some message he wanted to send to the city's power structure. And Minjun went nowhere without Amara. The child was 8 years old, recovering from a respiratory infection that had settled into his chest 3 weeks earlier and refused to fully leave. His cough came and went. His appetite was unreliable. He needed someone close. He needed her. That was the word she used to make herself feel better about going. Needed. She parked her 10-year-old Civic 4 blocks from the Hartwell Hotel and walked. The heels she'd bought to go with the dress were a half size too small. She'd been too proud to exchange them. And by the time she reached the hotel entrance, she could already feel a blister forming on her left heel. The doorman didn't look at her. That wasn't unusual. She'd worked for Kim Jong for 2 years, and she still wasn't used to the way the people who surrounded power performed their indifference. The doormen, the drivers, the security personnel in their dark suits, they looked through her. Not at her. Through. Like she was a window or a wall or something that simply didn't require acknowledgement. She gave her name. She waited. One of the men checked a list without making eye contact, made a small sound in his throat, and waved her through. The lobby of the Hartwell was the kind of space designed to make you feel small. Ceilings that went up 3 stories, marble floors that reflected everything back at you, enormous floral arrangements that cost more than Amara made in a month. She moved through it carefully, her heels clicking against the stone, and found the private elevator that led to the family suite where Minjun was being kept away from the main event. The boy was awake when she arrived. He was sitting on a brocade settee in a dark suit that looked both expensive and deeply uncomfortable, his feet not quite reaching the floor, a glass of orange juice going warm on the table beside him. When he saw Amara, something in his small face relaxed. "You're late," he said. "I'm exactly on time," she said, sitting beside him, pressing the back of her hand briefly against his forehead. Warm, but not alarming. "You eaten anything?" He shook his head. "Minjun." "I'm not hungry." She didn't argue. She'd learned not to fight him on food when his chest was bad. The congestion affected his appetite, and forcing it made things worse. She opened her bag and produced a small container of the sesame crackers he liked, the good ones from the Korean grocery on 5th, the ones she bought out of her own pocket and never mentioned to anyone. He took 3 crackers without being asked. She considered that a victory. For the next hour, she sat with him. They played cards. War. Because it was the one game where neither of them had to think too hard. He cheated twice, and she called him on it both times, and he grinned both times, the way children grin when they've been caught doing something that wasn't really wrong. Outside the suite, the sounds of the gala filtered up through the walls. Music, the low roar of 100 expensive conversations happening at once, occasional laughter sharp enough to carry. Around 9:15, Min-jun said, "I want water." Amara looked at the table, the glass of orange juice, the untouched water pitcher on the credenza across the room. She crossed to it, poured, brought it back. He drank half and set it down and looked at her. "The cold kind," he said. She almost smiled. She did not. "The cold kind." From downstairs, she looked at him. He looked back at her with the absolute shamelessness of a child who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided it wasn't his problem. "There's ice right there," she said, nodding at the credenza. "It's the wrong kind of cold," Min-jun said, with perfect, devastating 8-year-old logic. Amara sat with that for a moment. She knew she should call down to the hotel staff. That was the reasonable thing. But Hyun was off doing something for Kim, and she didn't know which staff member to trust with a request from the household, and honestly, and this was the thing she didn't say aloud, she needed to move. Sitting still for an hour in a hotel suite while a child played cards and half the city's power brokers drank champagne 40 feet away had done something to her shoulders, made them tight, made the space behind her eyes start to ache with the particular pressure of being somewhere you weren't quite sure you belonged. She told Min-jun she'd be right back. She told him not to touch the curtains. She wasn't entirely sure why she said that. It wasn't like he had a history with curtains, but it felt like the right kind of instruction to leave with an 8-year-old alone in a hotel suite. The private elevator opened onto a service corridor, which was where she was supposed to go. Turn left, follow it to the kitchen access, request cold water from catering, come back. Simple. She'd done it before. But she turned right instead of left. She didn't know why. She would think about it later, turn it over, try to assign it some significance or meaning, and she wouldn't be able to. It was just a wrong turn. One of those small, meaningless moments that end up mattering completely. The corridor opened into the back edge of the main ballroom. Amara stopped. She'd known intellectually that the gala was large. She'd seen the numbers in the briefing materials Hyun left on the kitchen counter. 400 guests, the city's philanthropic elite. Minimum donation threshold of $50,000 per table. She'd read those numbers like weather reports, accurate but abstract. Standing at the edge of the room, she felt the reality of it physically. The scale of it. The light from the crystal chandeliers was warm and gold and generous to everyone beneath it, and everyone beneath it was dressed in the language of money. Not the tasteful, careful money she sometimes saw in the lobbies of the buildings where Kim did business, but the loud, unambiguous, no apology necessary kind. Diamonds that caught the light and threw it back harder. Suits that fit because they'd been made for exactly one body. Women who moved like the room had been built around them. Amara stood very still in the doorway in her emerald dress and her slightly too small heels and the small silver earrings she'd borrowed from her sister, and she felt every single inch of herself at the same time. She was about to turn back. She had actually already shifted her weight, already started to turn, when the woman saw her. She would learn the name later. Victoria Aluldren, wife of Charles Aluldren, whose real estate development firm had partnered with Kim Jong's holding company on a commercial development project worth somewhere north of $800 million. A woman whose photograph appeared in the society pages so regularly that her face had become a kind of visual shorthand for a certain type of ambition dressed as grace. Victoria Aluldren was 51 years old, thin in the way that required daily discipline and occasionally showed in the face, and she had the social instincts of a creature that had spent decades at the top of a very specific food chain. She noticed deviation. She noticed things that were out of place. It was the skill that had gotten her here, and she'd refined it until it was almost elegant. She noticed Amara. The calculation happened so fast it almost didn't look like a calculation. A flicker in the eyes, the smallest reorientation of the body, and then she was moving, Not dramatically, not urgently, just with the smooth purpose of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her right to move through any space she chose. Two of her friends fell in to step behind her without being asked. They'd done this before. Amar saw them coming and didn't move. She didn't know why she didn't move. She would think about that too later. The reasonable thing would have been to step back into the corridor, to not engage, to disappear the way she was good at disappearing. But something in her had gone very quiet and very still, and her feet stayed where they were. Victoria stopped in front of her with a smile that had been engineered to pass for warmth at a distance. "I don't believe we've met," she said. Her voice was the kind of voice that carried without being raised, trained. "Are you with the catering staff?" Amar kept her face still. "No." "A vendor? The florists have been in and out all evening. I'm a guest." Victoria's smile didn't change. That was the frightening thing about it. It just stayed there, doing its work, independent of whatever was actually happening behind it. "Of course. I'm sorry, I just—" She glanced at Amar's dress with something that wasn't quite looking. "I didn't see you on the committee list. I know most of the regular attendees." "I'm not on the committee." "No?" The smile stretched a fraction. "Then who are you here with exactly?" Around them, the noise of the room hadn't changed. The music kept playing. The conversations kept rolling. But Amara was aware, the way you become aware of things when the air pressure shifts, that the immediate space around them had changed. 3 people nearby had stopped their own conversation. A man with a champagne glass had turned slightly. One of Victoria's friends had her phone half raised. "I work for the Zhang household," Amara said. Something moved across Victoria's face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation, like a suspicion that had just been proven correct. "Ah," she said, and there was so much in that single syllable, years of practiced superiority compressed into one small sound. "Of course." She let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to make sure the people nearby felt its shape, and then she said it. "Well." Her voice was pleasant, perfectly, terribly pleasant. "There are service entrances for a reason. People like you should know where you belong." The music was playing. The chandeliers were doing their warm, golden work. Somewhere in the room, a man laughed at something, and the laugh was big and genuine and completely unrelated to anything happening in this small, airless pocket of the party. Amara heard all of it. She heard the way the 2 women behind Victoria made almost no sound at all. The specific silence of people waiting to see what happens next. She heard the soft click of a phone camera. She heard, somewhere inside her own chest, something that had been tightening for a very long time pull itself even tighter. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise, sometime in her late 20s, after the 3rd or 4th time someone had used her body or her skin or her softness as evidence of something they'd already decided about her. She had made herself a promise that she would not cry in front of people who wanted to see it. It was the only weapon she'd ever found that worked consistently. She looked at Victoria Aluldrin for exactly 2 seconds. Not looking away, not looking down. 2 seconds of just looking, like she was committing something to memory. Then she turned and walked back into the corridor. Her heels clicked against the marble. Her shoulders were straight. Her hands, hanging at her sides, were perfectly still. She was halfway back to the service corridor when she felt the first sting in her eyes, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and kept walking. She did not get the cold water. She went back upstairs and told Minjun the kitchen was backed up, and she found a small refrigerator in the suite's secondary room and dug out a bottle of Perrier and poured it over ice and brought it to him, and he drank it and didn't say anything about whether it was the right kind of cold. She sat back down beside him. She picked up her cards. She played another round of war. She lost twice before she noticed her hands weren't entirely steady. She hadn't noticed. She was certain she hadn't noticed. She had been inside the suite. She had been away from the ballroom, the man who had been standing near the east wall of the main hall when she walked back through the corridor's entrance. She hadn't seen him because she hadn't looked up. If she'd looked up, she would have recognized him immediately. 400 guests in that room, and there was not a single person present who didn't know exactly where Kim Jong was standing at any given moment. He had watched her walk in. He had watched Victoria approach. He had watched the full length of the exchange, from 40 feet away, with the particular quality of attention that was his most recognizable characteristic. Not heated, not visible, just absolutely and completely present. The kind of watching that collects every detail and files it somewhere cold and permanent. When Amara turned and walked back into the corridor, Kim Jong's expression did not change. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed his phone, and typed a single message to Hyun. Find out who the Aluldran woman spoke to near the East Corridor entrance. Full background. Tonight. He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his glass. He went back to the conversation he'd been having with the city councilman, and nothing in his face or his voice indicated that anything had changed. But something had. In that room full of people who built their entire lives around knowing which way the wind was blowing, not one of them had felt it shift. Upstairs, Amara Bellamy dealt out another hand of war and told Minjun to stop slouching because it was bad for his lungs, and Minjun told her she sounded like his teacher, and she said good because his teacher was apparently the only other adult in his life with any sense. He laughed, small, real, a little wheezy at the edges. She kept her eyes on her cards. She was thinking about the way Victoria Aluldran's smile had never once reached her eyes, not even when it was at its warmest, its most practiced. She was thinking about the word belong and the way it had been used as a weapon, and the way weapons like that worked best when the person on the receiving end already half believed them. She was thinking about the dress. $342, 11 weeks in the closet, and the first time she'd worn it somewhere real, somewhere that mattered. The first time she'd let herself believe for even one evening that she could simply exist in a room without needing to justify it. She set her cards face down. I need a minute, she told Minjun. You just got back. I know. She stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the city below. All those lights, all those windows, all those rooms she would never be inside. Just a minute. She stood there with her forehead almost touching the glass, the cold coming through it in a thin, clean line, and she breathed. In and out, in and out. The city didn't look back at her. It never did. But it was something to look at that wasn't her own reflection. Behind her, Minjun was quiet. He was 8, not stupid. He could feel when the air in a room changed. After a while, he said quietly, Amara. Yeah. Are you okay? She breathed in, she breathed out. She turned around and her face was composed and steady and gave nothing away. I'm good, she said. Whose deal is it? He looked at her for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. Kim Jong's eyes, she always thought, the same particular quality of attention, frightening in a child because it was so much older than the face it lived in. Then he picked up the cards and dealt. Neither of them spoke about it. Downstairs, a man with a dragon tattoo along his neck excused himself from a conversation with the city councilman and walked very calmly toward the private elevator. He was going to check on his son. That was what he told himself. That was what he would tell anyone who asked. But there was a name on his phone now and a question waiting for an answer, and the particular kind of cold that settled into him when someone had made a mistake they didn't yet know they'd made. Victoria Aluldran was still laughing when the elevator doors closed. She had no way of knowing that the laughter had an expiration date, and it was coming faster than anyone in that ballroom could imagine. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and Kim Jong stepped out into the corridor without hurrying. Never hurried. That was the thing people misread about him, especially people who only knew him by reputation. They expected urgency, visible anger, the kinetic energy of a man who'd built an empire on intimidation. What they got instead was this. Measured footsteps, a stillness in the shoulders, eyes that moved across a space the way a camera moves, recording everything without reacting to any of it. Hyun was waiting by the suite door, young, compact, wearing the same dark suit he always wore, holding a tablet he always had. He'd been with Kim for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between the silences. This one was the bad kind. The woman, Kim said, without stopping. Hyun fell into step beside him. Victoria Aluldran, 51. Married to Charles Aluldran, Aluldran Development Group. Commercial real estate, primarily. They're the senior partner on the Meridian Tower project. He paused. Your project. Kim put his hand on the suite door and stopped. He didn't look at Hyun. What did she say exactly? It wasn't a question. Hyun had learned to hear the difference. Witnesses say she approached Ms. Bellamy near the East Corridor entrance. The conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. The phrase most consistently reported, Hyun's voice stayed flat, professional, was, "People like you should know where they belong." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere at the far end, an air conditioning unit cycled on and made a low, steady sound. Kim opened the door. Minjun was at the table, cards spread in front of him, face down. Amara was at the window with her back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the glass, looking out at the city. She turned when the door opened, and something crossed her face. Not fear exactly, more like the expression of someone who'd been somewhere private and had just been found there. "Hey," Kim said to Minjun. "Hey." Minjun's voice was careful. He was watching his father the way he always watched him, with that measuring quality that was too old for his face. "Amara's being weird." "I'm not being weird, Masram," Amara said, moving away from the window. She picked up her cards from the table. "Your dad just came to check on you. That's—" "Sit down," Kim said. She stopped. He said it the way he said most things, say, no particular edge to it, no volume, no performance, just the expectation of being heard. She sat. Minjun looked between the two of them and apparently decided this was the moment to become very interested in rearranging his card hand. Kim pulled a chair from the corner of the room, placed it across the table from Amara, and sat down. He set his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly, the way he looked at contracts and at people who were about to make decisions they couldn't take back. "Tell me what happened downstairs," he said. Amara's jaw tightened, a small movement, barely visible, the kind of thing you only caught if you were watching for it. "It was nothing. I took a wrong turn. I was in the ballroom for maybe 2 minutes. I came back up. That's all." "That's not what I'm asking." "I know what you're asking." She set her cards down. "And I'm telling you, it was nothing. Someone made a comment. People make comments. I've been handling comments my entire life without anyone's—" She stopped herself. Breathed. "I'm fine." Kim let the silence sit. He was good at that. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was a more precise instrument than most people gave it credit for. It had weight and shape and direction, and if you placed it correctly, it would do the work for you. Amara lasted about 8 seconds. "She asked if I was catering staff," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. "And then she told me people like me should know where they belong." She picked up her cards again, turned one over, set it back down. "I've heard worse." I walked away. "It's done." "It's not done," Kim said. "For me it is." "Amara." I said I'm fine. She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pain, but was built out of both of them, compressed into something harder. "I don't need anything. I handled it. Let it go." Kim looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Minjun. "You, bed." "It's 9:30. "Minjun." Minjun collected his cards with the expression of someone registering a formal protest while complying with a request, and disappeared into the suite's bedroom without further argument. He pulled the door most of the way closed. Not all the way. Kim noticed and didn't address it. Neither did Amara. When the boy was gone, Kim leaned back in his chair. He said, "How long have you worked for me?" Amara frowned. 2 years. You know how long. 2 years. In those 2 years, have I ever—" He paused, selecting the word with care. "Have I ever treated you as though your presence in my household required justification?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "Have I," he said, "ever made you feel like you didn't belong in a room?" "That's not the point. Answer the question." "No." The word came out quieter than she intended. "No, you haven't." "Then understand me when I say that a woman at a party does not speak to someone in my household that way." He said it the same way he said everything, that no decoration, no emphasis, just the fact of it. "That's not about you. That's about what is and isn't acceptable in a space I occupy." Amara stared at him. There was something moving through her expression that she was visibly trying to hold still, something complicated, something that didn't have a clean name. "Kim, she's Charles Aloldran's wife. You have an $800 million project with that man. I'm aware. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking you to leave it alone. I walked away. I handled it cleanly. If you go down there and make something out of it, it becomes a story. People talk. And it comes back on you in ways that... Amara. He said her name once, and she stopped. I heard you. Now I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually listen. She waited. You walked away because you've learned that walking away is what keeps you safe. You've been doing it so long it feels like strength. He leaned forward slightly. It's not strength. It's armor. There's a difference. The room was quiet. From behind the bedroom door there was the sound of Minjun adjusting himself in bed, the rustle of sheets, then silence. Amara looked down at the table. One hand was flat against the surface, and she was pressing it down, pressing hard enough that her knuckles had gone slightly lighter than the rest of her skin. I don't need a lesson, she said softly. I know you don't. Kim stood, straightened his jacket. Go home after Minjun's settled. I'll have Lee drive you. She looked up. I have my car. Your car's on Clement. Lee will drive you. She didn't argue. He moved toward the door and she said without turning around, What are you going to do? He stopped with his hand on the door frame. Nothing dramatic, he said. And then he left, and the way he said it told her absolutely nothing, which was exactly what he intended. Downstairs, Charles Aluldrin was on his third glass of whiskey and feeling the particular warmth of a man whose city was, for the moment, entirely within his understanding. The Meridian Tower deal was solid. Kim Jong was a difficult partner. Difficult meaning unknowable, meaning the meeting sometimes ran long because Kim sat in silences that made the lawyers nervous. But the money was clean and the permits were moving, and Charles had learned not to ask too many questions about how Kim managed to move things through certain city offices faster than seemed mathematically possible. Victoria was beside him, laughing at something the councilman's wife had said. She looked good tonight. She always looked good at these things. It was one of the things he'd married her for, back when that had still felt like a compliment rather than a management strategy. 22 years. He had learned to see her as a function, and he suspected she had learned the same about him, and they had reached a kind of equilibrium that worked, mostly. He saw Kim Jong approaching from across the room and adjusted his posture automatically, the way you adjusted your posture for people who required it. Kim extended his hand. Charles shook it. Good evening, Kim said. Good evening. Charles smiled, the professional one. Hell of a turnout tonight. It is. Kim's eyes moved briefly to Victoria, who had registered his approach and was already rotating toward him with her full social machinery engaged, the smile coming up like a light switching on. Mrs. Aluldrin. Mr. Kim. She extended her hand. We were just saying, the venue selection this year was truly... I'll need 15 minutes with Charles, Kim said, when you have a moment. He looked at Charles. Not a question. Victoria's hand came back without having been taken. The smile held. Everything else in her face held too. The professional immovability of a woman who'd been in enough rooms to know that a slight required a response, but the response needed to be calibrated. Charles handed his whiskey to Victoria and said, Of course. They moved to one of the private alcoves off the main hall. 2 leather chairs, a small table. The muffled noise of the party filtered through thick curtains. Kim sat. Charles sat. One of Kim's men positioned himself at the entrance to the alcove in a way that was not threatening and was entirely threatening. What's on your mind? Charles said. Kim was quiet for a moment. Not the social kind of quiet. The working kind. The Meridian Project, he said. I've been reconsidering the partnership structure. Charles went very still. Reconsidering? There are aspects of the arrangement I'm not satisfied with. I think we're not aligned on certain fundamentals. Charles felt the whiskey warmth in his chest start to cool. We've been aligned for 14 months. The permits are through. We break ground in... I know the timeline. Then what? Charles stopped. Reset. He was not a man who showed alarm. It was one of his better qualities, and he deployed it now. Walk me through the concern. What specifically are we not aligned on? Kim looked at him steadily. Character, he said. The words sat between them like something that had been placed there deliberately, like a document slid across a table for signature. Charles kept his face neutral. But something had shifted behind his eyes. Not understanding yet, not quite, but the beginning of something. The scent of something wrong. I'm not sure I follow. I do business with people I trust, Kim said. I've told you that, you've heard it. I think you believed I meant financially. And you didn't. I meant entirely. Kim held his gaze. Tonight, someone in my household was spoken to in a way I find unacceptable. The person responsible is someone with whom I am in business. Charles's mind was moving fast now, very fast, assembling pieces. The evening, the gala, who'd been where, what Victoria had been doing when he'd last seen her across the room, the way she sometimes moved through these events like a ship that hadn't learned to check for underwater obstacles. Kim, he said carefully, if something happened tonight that caused offense, it wasn't offense, Kim said. Offense is when someone interrupts you. What happened tonight was a choice, a deliberate choice, made in front of witnesses to humiliate a person based on how she looked. He paused. That tells me something about the values of the household. Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not panic. He didn't panic. It wasn't in his construction, but the specific dread of a man who can see very clearly the shape of a mistake he didn't make but is going to pay for. My wife's behavior reflects on your household, Kim said. Yes. The alcove was very quiet. Charles could hear his own breathing, which he didn't usually notice. He could hear the muffled bass of the music from the ballroom. What are you proposing? Charles said. Nothing tonight. Kim stood, straightened his jacket. I'll have my attorneys reach out next week regarding the restructuring. We can handle it professionally. He looked at Charles with something that wasn't anger and wasn't warmth, something much more unsettling, which was simple clarity. I'd encourage you to have a conversation with your wife about what happened this evening. He left the alcove. Charles sat for a full minute without moving. Then he reached for his phone. Victoria was still in the main hall when Charles found her, still holding his whiskey glass, now laughing at something else with two women whose names Charles could never keep straight. He put his hand on her elbow, gently, firmly, and felt her stiffen slightly before she turned with the smooth professional pivot of a woman who had trained herself not to react visibly to unexpected contact. Darling, she said. A word, Charles said. The two women registered the shift in energy and found other places to be. Charles drew Victoria a few steps from the nearest cluster of guests. Not so far that the movement looked dramatic, just far enough. He kept his voice low and even. What did you say to the Zhang woman? He said. Victoria's eyes sharpened. The Zhang? You mean the caregiver? She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I simply pointed out that... What did you say, Victoria? She looked at him, read his face. The smile didn't disappear. It changed quality, became the one she used when she was recalibrating. I may have been pointed. She was standing in the middle of the ballroom looking completely out of... He's pulling out of the deal, Charles said. The smile stopped. He came to me 20 minutes ago, Charles continued. Talked about character, about household values. He looked at his wife with an expression she hadn't seen from him in a long time. Not anger, not disappointment. Those were emotions he'd processed and moved past years ago. This was something rawer, something closer to the surface. $800 million, Victoria. 14 months of work. Because of... She stopped. Because of what I said to a... Yes, Charles said. Exactly because. Victoria's face was doing something difficult. The social architecture of it, the structure she maintained so carefully, the symmetry of the expression, was under visible strain. He can't be serious, she said. He's not going to collapse a commercial real estate deal over... He already did, Charles said. Tonight, just now, in that alcove. He looked across the ballroom at the space where Kim Jong had been standing and was no longer. I need you to understand what just happened. I need you to actually understand it, not manage it, not explain it. Understand it. Victoria said nothing. Her jaw was set. That woman, Charles said, whoever she is to Kim Jong's household, she matters to him in a way that we did not know about and did not account for. He finally took his whiskey back from her hand and drank what was left. And now we are on the wrong side of that. I'll apologize, Victoria said immediately. I'll send a note. Don't. Charles's voice was sharp enough that a woman nearby glanced over. He lowered it. Do not do anything right now. Let me handle this. He looked at her for a long moment. Go home. Tell the car I'll be another hour. Victoria looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. She gathered herself, visibly, physically, the shoulders squaring, the chin lifting, the whole apparatus of composure reassembling, and turned and moved toward the exit with perfect posture and not one visible sign of distress. Charles watched her go. Then he turned back to the room, to the ballroom full of people who were still laughing and drinking and talking about nothing, and he tried to think of who he could call, who he knew, what possible leverage existed between him and a man who had just walked away from $800 million without raising his voice. The answer that came back to him was quiet and cold and not encouraging. Upstairs, Amara was sitting on the edge of the suite's small sofa with her shoes off, her feet on the carpet, listening to Minjun's breathing through the cracked bedroom door. Even, slow, the slight rough edge of the congestion settling. He was asleep. She had her phone in her hand and she was staring at it without looking at anything on the screen. She was thinking about what Kim had said, armor, not strength, and how much she wanted to dismiss it and how much she couldn't, because the worst thing about accurate observations was that they didn't care whether you were ready to hear them. She had spent 15 years building a life that fit within the space she was allowed. She'd done it carefully, methodically, the education, the certifications, the careful cultivation of a professional reputation, the absolute avoidance of anything that could be used against her. She had made herself small enough to be safe. She had convinced herself that was wisdom. And it was, in a way. She understood that. The world was the world. It had a shape, and she had learned the shape, and she had moved within it without breaking too many things. That was not nothing. But Kim's voice kept running back through her head. Not the content of it, the tone, the complete absence of pity in it. Most people, when they talked to her about things like this, had pity in their voice whether they meant to or not. The careful handling of it, the delicate stepping around the subject like it was something that might collapse if touched too directly. Kim had spoken to her like someone speaks to a person who doesn't need protecting from the truth. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or furious, and the uncertainty of that was its own kind of exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. A message from her younger sister, Deja. How's the fancy party? Hello, all. She stared at it, put the phone face down on the cushion beside her. From the hallway outside the suite, she heard the elevator arrive. Footsteps. Then quiet. Then, after a moment, a knock. 3 short ones, the Hyun knock. She'd learned his rhythms, and she crossed to the door. Hyun looked at her with the expression he always wore, which was the expression of a man who had permanently opted out of having expressions. Mr. Kim has arranged for Lee to take you home when you're ready, he said. He also wanted you to have this. He extended a small envelope. Amara looked at it. What is that? He didn't specify. She took it. Hyun nodded, turned, left. She closed the door and stood in the middle of the suite, with the envelope in her hand and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't categorize, something between dread and something else that was warmer and more dangerous than dread. She opened it. Inside was a card, plain cream-colored, no letterhead. Kim's handwriting, which she recognized from the notes he sometimes left about Minjun's appointments and medications. Clean, precise, slightly too careful to be casual. You were in the right room. You were always in the right room. Hey. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her bag. She stood in the quiet suite with Minjun's breathing coming through the cracked door and the sound of the city beyond the glass, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Seen. Not managed, not accommodated, not tolerated. Seen. And that feeling, warm and frightening and completely unwelcome in its timing, was exactly what she was turning over in her mind when her phone buzzed again. Not a message from Deja this time. A call. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Smooth, controlled, and entirely recognizable, even though Amara had only heard it once for 90 seconds, in a ballroom she hadn't meant to walk into. Ms. Bellamy, Victoria Aloldran said, I think we should talk, just the two of us. Before this goes any further. Amara's hand tightened on the phone. Through the bedroom door, Minjun shifted in his sleep. The city pressed its lights against the window. And Amara Bellamy, who had spent her entire life knowing exactly when to walk away, stood completely still and said nothing, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she genuinely didn't know what the right move was. And that uncertainty, that single crack in the armor Kim had named so precisely, was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her all night. Amara stood with the phone against her ear and said nothing for long enough that Victoria Aloldran said, Ms. Bellamy, are you there? I'm here, Amara said. Good. A pause on the other end. The sound of movement, a door closing, the ambient noise of the gala dropping away to near silence. Victoria was finding somewhere private. That meant she was serious. I want to be direct with you. That would be a change, Amara said. A beat. Fair enough. And something in Victoria's voice shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed register, the way a musician changes key. The social architecture dropped away, and what was left underneath was harder and more interesting. I owe you an apology for what I said in the ballroom. I said it in front of people, and I said it deliberately, and it was wrong. Amara waited. But I need you to understand something, Victoria continued. What's happening between my husband and Kim Jong? That cannot be collateral damage from one bad moment at a party. There are 47 people employed by the Meridian Project. Architects, contractors, site managers, people with families. If this deal collapses, don't, Amara said. Don't what? Don't put 47 employees on me. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I didn't collapse anything. I walked across a room in a green dress and you decided to make it a lesson. That's not on me. Victoria was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. Another pause. But I'm asking you to talk to him, to Kim. Tell him this has gone far enough. Amara almost laughed. You think I tell Kim Jong what to do? I think he listens to you in ways he doesn't listen to other people, Victoria said, and the precision of that observation landed in Amara's chest with unexpected weight. I've heard things about how he treats the household, about Minjun, about the fact that in 2 years you are the only caregiver who's lasted more than 4 months. She let that sit. So yes, I think if you asked him to let this go, he would consider it. Amar's jaw was tight. She was standing in the middle of the suite, one hand at her side, the other pressing the phone against her ear hard enough that the edge of it was cutting slightly into her cheekbone. She was thinking about Kim's card, about the handwriting on it, about the word always, which was a word you used deliberately, not casually. I'll think about it, she said. Ms. Bellamy. I said, I'll think about it. She hung up. She stood for a moment in the quiet suite. Then she went to the window, pressed her forehead against the glass the way she had earlier, and closed her eyes. The city made its sounds, traffic, distant, wind against the upper floors. Below, a taxi horn, short and irritable. She stayed like that for 60 seconds, maybe 90. Then she straightened, picked up her bag, checked on Minjun one more time, still asleep, breathing steady, one hand tucked under his cheek the way he always slept, and she texted Lee that she was ready. She did not call Kim, not that night. The next morning came in gray and cold, the kind of November morning that felt like the city was conserving its energy for something. Amara was at her kitchen table with coffee she wasn't drinking, her phone face up in front of her, when the first alert came through. She had a Google alert set for Kim Jong's name. She'd set it 2 years ago when she took the job, the kind of reasonable professional caution that felt prudent when you were walking into a household with that particular reputation. She'd stopped reading most of them after the first few months. They were usually financial news, occasionally something about city development, rarely anything alarming. This one was from a business publication she didn't recognize. Small, the kind of outlet that covered commercial real estate and corporate movements in the mid-tier way that most people never read. Sources confirm. Jong Holdings withdrawing from Meridian Tower Partnership. Aloldran Development faces timeline and financing questions. She read it twice, put her phone down, picked up her coffee. It had happened faster than she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly. Kim had said the attorneys would reach out next week, which she'd taken to mean the process would be slow, deliberate, professional. Instead, it had apparently moved overnight, the way things moved when someone with Kim Jong's particular infrastructure decided they were done waiting. Her phone rang. Not Kim, not Victoria. Her sister Deja. She let it ring. It rang again. She picked up. "Did you see the news?" Deja said without preamble. "Good morning to you too. Amara, the Alul Dren deal. Kim Jong just blew up an $800 million project. People at the architecture firm Marcus works at were talking about it this morning. They had people attached to that project. Deja's voice dropped. "Is this because of what happened at the party last night?" Amara was quiet. "Oh my God," Deja said. "It is. I don't know everything Kim does or why he does it. Amara, did he do this because of what happened to you? The way Deja said the weight in it." Amara set down her coffee carefully, like it was something that required careful setting down. "I don't know," she said. It was partly true. "You need to be careful," Deja said. Her voice had changed. Quieter now, the big sister frequency she shifted into when she was genuinely worried. "I know he's been good to you. I know Minjun. Deja, listen to me. Men like Kim Jong don't do things out of kindness. They do things because it serves them. And when it stops serving them," she stopped. "I just don't want you to be standing in the wrong place when the math changes." "I hear you," Amar said. "Do you?" "Yes." She looked out her kitchen window. A pigeon was sitting on the fire escape railing, completely unbothered by the cold. "I hear you." She hung up and sat with Deja's words and the pigeon and the cold gray light for a while. She wasn't naive. She knew what Kim Jong was. She'd known from the first interview when she'd sat across from him in that glass-walled office and answered his questions about Minjun's medical history and care philosophy, while two men with the specific build of people who spent a lot of time in gyms and not much time explaining themselves stood silently near the door. She'd known what she was walking into. She'd made the choice anyway, because the pay was real and the benefit package was real, and Minjun had looked at her from across the room with those serious, watchful eyes, and something in her had simply responded to him. She didn't think Kim Jong's interest in her welfare was manipulation. She also didn't think it was simple. What she thought, if she was being honest with herself in her cold kitchen on a gray morning with coffee going stale in her cup, was that she had no idea what it was, and that not knowing was the most frightening thing about all of it. She showered. She changed. She drove to the Jong residence. The house was in the upper part of the city, a neighborhood that had been expensive for 100 years and intended to stay that way. The residence itself was a double lot, converted from two original structures, now one continuous thing, all clean lines and serious landscaping, and the particular quality of security that was invisible until you noticed all the ways it was invisible. Cameras that didn't look like cameras. A gate that opened before you had to stop for it. She parked in the usual spot. She went in through the side entrance. Mrs. Park, who managed the household, was in the kitchen and said good morning without looking up from whatever she was organizing in the refrigerator, which was the normal way Mrs. Park said good morning and indicated that the morning was so far within acceptable parameters. Minjun was in his room, already dressed, sitting at his desk with a book he wasn't reading. He looked up when Amara came in. "You're earlier than usual," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said, which was true. She checked him over quickly. Not formally, just the practiced eye of someone who'd been monitoring his recovery for 3 weeks. Color was better. Eyes were clear. The shadows under them were lighter. "How's the chest?" He breathed in deliberately, testing. "Okay," he said. Mostly I'll take." She sat on the edge of his desk. "Did you eat breakfast?" "Mrs. Park made eggs." "And?" "I ate some of them." Minjun. "Most of them," he said. "The yolk parts are weird when they're too cooked." She let it go. She looked around his room. The neat rows of books, the model of the solar system on the shelf his father had helped him build last spring, the small framed photograph on his desk of a woman she'd never asked about and Kim had never mentioned. The boy's mother. Amara knew almost nothing about her except that she was gone, and that her absence had a shape in this household the way all large absences have shapes, taking up the space of what isn't there. She'd been with Minjun for 20 minutes, running through his morning medications and talking through his school reading with him, when Hyun appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Kim would like to see you," he said. "When you have a moment." She looked at Hyun. Hyun looked back with his standard expression, which told her nothing. "Where is he?" "Study." She told Minjun she'd be back. She followed Hyun down the corridor, up a half-flight of stairs, to the room that faced the back garden. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that were actually used, a desk that was actually worked at, 2 chairs by the window that looked out over the garden's winter bare trees. Kim was at the desk when she came in. He looked up. Hyun withdrew and the door clicked shut. "Sit down," Kim said. "I keep being told that," she said, but she sat. He closed the folder in front of him. He looked at her with that quality of attention she'd spent 2 years learning to read and still didn't fully trust herself to interpret. "You heard about the Meridian announcement?" "This morning, yes. I want you to understand the decision had nothing to do with you directly." She frowned. "Okay." "It had to do with a pattern of behavior in the Aluldrin household that I've been aware of for some time." He said it like he was reading from a document, not in a cold way, but in the precise way of someone who had thought carefully about the words before using them. Last night was the most visible example, but it wasn't the only data. Amara looked at him. "What does that mean?" Kim opened a different folder. He slid a single page across the desk. She picked it up. It was a summary, clean, formatted, the kind of thing a competent analyst produces. At the top, Aluldrin Development Group, Internal Ethics Review. Below that, a series of dated entries. An employment discrimination complaint from 2019 settled quietly. A hostile work environment finding from a city contractor review in 2021 suppressed through what the document described as informal remediation. A pattern of vendor selection practices that appeared to consistently exclude minority-owned firms from project bids. She read down the page. Slowly. Her face stayed still, but her chest was doing something complicated. "This was prepared before last night?" she said. "The first draft was completed 8 months ago," Kim said. "When I began considering the Meridian partnership seriously, I had the Aluldrin organization reviewed, as I review any significant partner." He paused. "What happened last night confirmed a conclusion I had already largely reached." Amar set the page down carefully. She was thinking about what Victoria had said on the phone. 47 employees, people with families. The implication that Amara held some lever of responsibility for what was happening. She was thinking about it differently now. "You were already planning to pull out," she said. "I was considering it. Last night accelerated the timeline." She leaned back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I imagine you spoke to Victoria Aluldrin last night after you left the gala," he said, and the flatness with which he said it told her he wasn't guessing. "And I imagine she gave you the impression that you had some power over what happened to her family's business interests. I want you to understand clearly that you don't, and you never did. This decision belongs to me." Amara stared at him. "She called me." "I know." "How?" Hyun monitors calls to household staff when there's an active business situation. Standard protocol. He said it without apology. "I should have warned you that might happen. I didn't. That was an oversight on my part." She held on to that for a moment. The matter-of-fact way he said it. The acknowledgement of the oversight, which from Kim Jong was about as close to an apology as things got. "So you listened to my call," she said. "Hyun did. He reported it to me this morning. And you don't see a problem with that." Kim was quiet for a second. A genuine second, not a strategic one. "It's a security protocol I use across all staff. It has nothing to do with personal trust in you specifically, but I understand if it feels like a violation," she said. "Yes," he said. "I understand if it feels like that." She breathed in, out. She was doing the thing she always did, the internal triage, separating what she actually felt from what was an appropriate professional response. Calibrating. "Victoria thinks I can influence you," she said finally. "Apparently. Can I?" He looked at her steadily. "On some things." "On this?" "No." She nodded. She looked at the page still on the desk between them. The ethics review, the pattern of behavior documented in clean professional language. She thought about the ballroom, about the 90 seconds that hadn't been 90 seconds, that had been a compressed version of something much longer, something with the weight of years behind it. What happens to the project, she said. It will be restructured or absorbed. Another developer will come in. And the 47 employees? Something moved in his face. Brief. Where did you get that number? Victoria. He looked at the window, at the bare winter garden. Most project employees work on contract structures that transfer with the project. They'll be fine. A pause. She wasn't wrong that there are people affected. She was wrong to use it as leverage against you. He looked back at her. Those are two different things. Amara picked up the ethics review page. Read it one more time. Put it back on the desk. I need to ask you something, she said. He waited. What am I to you? She said it directly, without softening it, because she'd decided on the drive over that if she was going to ask it, she was going to ask it cleanly. Not what the job description says, actually, because what happened last night, the way you moved, how fast things moved after, that's not how an employer reacts when someone is rude to an employee. The room was very quiet. From somewhere in the house, muffled, she could hear Minjun's television, the particular sound effect of whatever space documentary he was currently working through. Kim looked at her for a long time, long enough that she began to believe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, Minjun's mother left when he was 3. She hadn't expected that. She stayed still. She wasn't equipped for this life, he said, without bitterness, which was its own particular kind of sad. She made the right choice for herself. She left arrangements that were fair, and she's been consistent about them. He paused. For 5 years, this household has been managed, professionally, competently. People who did their jobs and kept appropriate distance. He looked at his hands briefly, then back up. You are the first person in 5 years who talks to him like he's just a boy. She didn't say anything. Not the son of someone powerful, not a responsibility or a patient or a professional obligation, just a boy. His voice was the same quality it always was, yet level, controlled, no decoration, but there was something underneath it that she'd never heard before, something that had weight to it. That matters to me in a way that is not professional. The space between the words and what they meant sat in the room like a third presence. Amara looked at the desk, at the closed folder, at the ethics review. She said, That's a complicated thing to hear from someone who just told me his assistant monitors my phone calls. It is, he said, and who runs the kind of organization that… She stopped. That I run, he said. Just that. No defense of it, no explanation, just the acknowledgement. She looked at him. She thought about Deja's voice that morning. Men like Kim Jong don't do things out of kindness. They do things because it serves them. She thought about the card in her bag. You were always in the right room. She thought about armor versus strength, and how you couldn't always tell which one you were wearing until someone called it by name. I'm going to go check on Minjun, she said. Kim nodded. She stood, gathered herself, the small, physical act of gathering herself that she performed so automatically she barely noticed it anymore, and moved toward the door. She had her hand on the handle when he said, Amara. She stopped. Victoria Aluldran is not going to leave this alone, he said. She's going to keep looking for something, a way back or a way through or something to use. He said it the way he said everything. Not a warning exactly, more like information placed where it could be used. Be careful what you share with people who are not in this house. She felt something go cold in her stomach, not quite fear, something adjacent to it. What do you mean, something to use? He was quiet for a moment. I mean what I said. She's resourceful. She's been in this city a long time, and she's now in the position of someone who has lost something significant and needs to understand why. He looked at her steadily. People in that position look for explanations. Sometimes they find them. Sometimes they manufacture them. She held his gaze. Are you telling me she might go after me specifically? I'm telling you it's possible, he said, and I want you to know that if she does, His phone rang. He looked at it. Something in his face changed, the smallest possible change, the kind she wouldn't have caught 6 months ago. He looked back at her. "Give me a moment." She nodded and stepped out, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. She stood in the hallway. Through the door she could hear his voice, low, clipped, the Korean shifting in when he was stressed, which she'd learned to read as its own kind of signal. She heard her own name once, which sent a specific cold current through her that she didn't have a category for. Then she heard something else. A name. Not her name. A name she recognized because she'd heard it in passing, in overheard conversations, and in the business news she'd started paying more attention to since taking this job. Raymond Park, Charles Aluldren's attorney, the man who had apparently been quietly managing Aluldren Development Group's legal architecture for 12 years. She shouldn't have been listening. She stayed where she was. Kim's voice on the other side of the door rose briefly, still not loud, but sharp, the way a temperature drops sharply. And she caught fragments. Something about documentation, something about timing, and then, very clearly, in English, "When?" A pause. "How long has he had it?" Another pause. Then silence. Then the sound of the phone being set down on a hard surface, harder than necessary. Amara stepped back from the door. She moved to the small bench in the hallway and sat down and put her hands flat on her knees. Whatever had just happened in that room, it was not good. She understood that with the kind of bone-level clarity that doesn't require information. The study door opened. Kim came out. He looked at her, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not alarm. He wasn't built for visible alarm. But a tightening, a recalculation happening live behind the eyes. "There's a problem," he said. "I heard," she said. "Partly." He looked at her for a moment. Raymond Park has been working with a journalist. Investigative piece. He said it in pieces, like each piece needed its own space. The focus is Jong Holdings, financial structure, source of capital, business relationships with city officials. He paused. And the household. Amara went very still. The household. Yes. What about the household? He held her gaze. You, he said. Your background. Your finances. A pause that felt like something being placed on a scale. Your brother. The hallway felt different. The air had a texture to it that it hadn't had a moment ago. She stood up slowly. Her hands had gone cold. What about my brother? Marcus Bellamy, Kim said. And she knew immediately from the way he said the name, carefully, the way you're careful with something sharp, that this was not information he'd just learned. This was information he'd had, information he'd chosen when to share. He had a charge, Kim said, 4 years ago, fraud, small scale, dismissed after... I know what happened with Marcus, she said. Her voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from calm. I was there. I helped pay the attorney. She looked at him. What does that have to do with anything? On its own, nothing, Kim said. In a story designed to suggest that your presence in this household serves a purpose beyond caregiving, with the implication that you were placed here through connection to... He stopped. He chose his words. The story isn't about what's true. It's about what can be made to look plausible. Amara heard what he was saying. She heard the architecture of it, the way you could take the facts of her life, the brother, the cleared charge, the job with the city's most powerful criminal organization, and arrange them into a shape that meant something completely different from what they actually were. She heard it, and her vision went slightly bright at the edges, the way it went when she was holding something very large, very still. Raymond Park works for Charles Aluldren, she said. Yes. Who you pulled out of an $800 million deal last night. Yes. And now there's a journalist with a story about your household. She looked at him. About me. Kim said nothing. You told me to be careful about what Victoria might use, she said, and you already knew this was in motion. I learned the full scope 30 seconds ago, he said. I knew there was a journalist. I didn't know the household angle until this call. She nodded very slowly. She was doing the triage again, but the thing she was triaging this time was too large and too hot to separate neatly. She was thinking about Deja's voice, about armor and strength, about 47 employees and ethical review documents and cards written in careful handwriting. She was thinking about how the last 18 hours had assembled themselves into something she hadn't chosen and couldn't now unchoose. She was thinking that she had spent 15 years keeping herself below the line of visibility, making herself safe through smallness, and that in one accidental wrong turn through a ballroom door, she had stepped into a story that was now being written about her, whether she participated or not. "What do you need from me?" she said. Kim looked at her. She watched him read her. The question, the tone of it, what it meant that she was asking it that way rather than walking out. "I need to know," he said carefully, "whether you trust me." And there it was, the real question. The one underneath everything else, the one that had been building since a wrong turn in a hotel corridor the night before, the one she'd been circling without landing on. She looked at Kim Jong, the man who had moved an entire business arrangement because of 90 seconds in a ballroom, who had kept a card simple and true, who had listened to her phone calls through a security protocol and told her about it directly, who had a dragon tattoo along his neck and a dead business deal, and a journalist with a story about her brother. And she understood with absolute clarity that the answer she gave in the next 5 seconds was going to determine the shape of everything that came after. Her hands were still cold. Minjun's television sounds filtered down the hallway, the voice of a documentary narrator describing the distance between stars. She opened her mouth. "Yes," Amara said. "I trust you." She said it the way you say something you've decided rather than something you feel, which was its own kind of honesty, because decisions were what you actually controlled. Feelings were weather. You didn't decide whether. You decided whether to go outside. Kim looked at her for one more second. Then he nodded, once, the way he confirmed things he'd already prepared for. He moved back toward the study door. "Stay in the house today," he said. "Don't go home. Don't make calls from your personal phone." He stopped in the doorway. "I'm going to need a few hours." "What are you going to do?" "What I do," he said, and closed the door. She stood in the hallway alone. The documentary voice was still coming from Minjun's room. Something about light years. Something about how the light you see from a star might be older than everything you've ever known. Might be light from something that no longer exists. She went to check on Minjun. It was the only thing she was certain she should do. He was on his bed with his tablet, the documentary filling the small screen. He looked up when she came in, registered something in her face, and said nothing about it, which was the thing about Minjun that she loved most and found most unnerving. He had his father's economy. He spent his attention carefully. "Come sit," he said, and shifted over on the bed. She sat beside him. He tilted the tablet so they could both see. On screen, a simulation of the universe expanding. All those galaxies moving away from each other at speeds that made human urgency feel briefly absurd. She sat with him and watched and breathed. 40 minutes later, he unknocked. He didn't come into the room. He stood in the doorway and looked at Amara with the particular quality of his non-expression that she'd learned meant something was in motion. "Mr. Kim is ready," he said. She looked at Minjun. He was already looking at her. "Go," he said. 8 years old and sounding 40. "I'm fine," she followed Hyun. The study had changed configuration. The desk was cleared. 2 additional people were in the room. A woman Amara didn't recognize, 50s, sharp-faced, wearing the kind of suit that read as legal without any visible signifier you could point to, and a man she did recognize, David Cho, who she knew as Kim's primary legal counsel and who she'd seen twice before in contexts that made clear he was not a man who appeared in rooms unless the stakes justified it. Kim was standing at the window with his back to the room. He turned when she came in. "Sit down," David Cho said, which was the 3rd time in 2 days someone had said that to her, and she was beginning to feel a specific way about it. She sat. "Ms. Bellamy." David Cho's voice was the efficient voice of a man who billed by 6-minute increments and had internalized that rhythm into his actual speech patterns. "I'm going to be direct. The story Raymond Park has been feeding to the journalist, a woman named Caroline Stearns, staff writer at the Metropolitan Examiner, has been in development for approximately 4 months. The household angle was added approximately 6 weeks ago. He set a folder on the table in front of her. This is what we know about the current draft. She looked at the folder, didn't open it yet. How do you know what's in a draft? A brief pause. Nobody answered that question. She opened the folder. The summary inside was 3 pages. She read it with the careful, slowing down attention she used when something required her full comprehension rather than her quick processing. The story's architecture was what Kim had described: Jong holdings, financial sourcing, relationships with 3 specific city officials. That was the frame. But the household section was longer than she'd expected and more specific than she'd feared. Her name, her employment history, the fact that she'd been hired 6 weeks after Marcus's fraud charge was cleared. A quote from an unnamed source describing her as Kim Jong's personal confidant with unusual access to household decision-making. The implication, never stated directly, assembled through proximity, that her placement in the household had been facilitated through channels that connected her brother's legal situation to Kim's organization. She read it twice. The second time she read it, she felt a specific, clean anger that was different from the hot thing that had been building since last night. This was cold, architectural. The anger of someone who understood exactly how the thing in front of them was designed to work. This is fabricated, she said. Largely, David Cho said. My brother's case and my employment have nothing to do with each other. We know that. The timeline is wrong. I interviewed with Kim 3 months before Marcus's case was even filed. We know that too. David Cho leaned forward. The problem isn't what's true. The problem is what's printable. Caroline Stearns is careful. She won't print what she can't defend, but she doesn't need to print the lie. She just needs to print the question and let the reader do the rest. He looked at her steadily. If this story runs in its current form, it will follow you, professionally, permanently. It will define how every future employer, every person who Googles your name, understands who you are. The woman Amara didn't recognize spoke for the first time. I'm Helena Voss, Communications and Crisis Management. Her voice was flat and professional, in a different register than David Cho's. Less legal, more tactical. I've been retained to manage the public dimension of this situation. I want to talk to you about what we can do preemptively and what we need from you to do it. Amara looked at her. What do you need from me? A full account of your employment history. Your relationship with your brother, specifically the period before and during his legal situation. Any communications you've had with Victoria or Charles Aloldran, including last night's phone call. Helena held her gaze. And I need to know if there's anything else, anything at all, that could be used. Not what you think matters. Anything. The room was waiting. Kim was still at the window. Amara was aware of him the way you're aware of a current in water, not looking at it directly, but feeling the direction of it constantly. She thought about everything she'd ever done that could be framed incorrectly by someone who needed it to mean something different than it did. She thought about the years of careful navigation, the deliberate smallness, the avoidance of exactly this kind of exposure. She thought about how none of it had been enough. There's nothing, she said. But that's not the point, is it? No, Helena said. It isn't. The point is that I'm a plus-size black woman working in the home of a Korean organized crime figure, and my brother had a fraud charge. She said it plainly, without bitterness, just the fact of the assembly. You don't need truth to make that read a certain way. Helena didn't flinch. No, you don't. So what do we do? Helena and David Cho exchanged a brief look. Kim, at the window, turned around. We move first, Kim said. Before Stearns publishes, we give her something larger. Amara looked at him. What does that mean? It means the story Raymond Park has been feeding her is about my organization, my finances, my relationships with city officials. He said it without evasion, which she noticed and noted. Some of what Park has given her is accurate. Some of it is selectively accurate, which is a different thing. What he hasn't given her, what he doesn't have, is the full picture of what those city relationships actually involve. David Cho said, there's a land use reform initiative that Kim's organization has been quietly funding through a series of nonprofit structures. Affordable housing, community land trusts, 3 neighborhoods in the Southern District. It's been deliberately low profile because the politics of it are complicated when my name is attached. Kim said. Amara looked at him. You've been funding affordable housing. Among other things. Through nonprofits. Legally structured ones. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to see me as something I'm not. I'm telling you that the full picture is more complicated than what Park has handed Stearns, and complicated is something a journalist like Stearns is professionally obligated to pursue. Amara sat with that for a moment. You're going to give her a better story. I'm going to give her the complete story, Kim said, and let her decide which version is more interesting. Something in that was almost elegant, in the cold architectural way that Kim's solutions were often almost elegant. She sat with it for 3 seconds, and then something snagged in her mind, something small and specific, and she looked at David Cho. You said Park has been developing this for 4 months, she said. Correct. And the household angle was added 6 weeks ago. She paused. 6 weeks ago is when Kim walked away from the Meridian project pre-officially, before last night. Which means, she looked at Kim. The gala wasn't the beginning, she said slowly. You'd already started pulling back from Aluldrin before last night. Correct, Kim said, and Park knew, or Aluldrin knew, and they started building this in response. She stopped. Last night, Victoria approaching me, was that staged? A silence in the room that had a specific texture. We don't know, Hyun said from the doorway, which was the first time she'd registered he was still there. It may have been opportunistic. She saw you in the room and used the moment. Or it was designed to destabilize, Helena said. Create an emotional situation that might cause Kim to make a visible, reactive move that could be documented. Amara thought about the phone recording. She thought about the guests who'd turned to watch. She thought about the person with the phone half raised. Someone was recording it, she said. Helena nodded. We've identified at least 2 recordings circulating in private channels. Neither has gone public yet. They're holding it, Kim said, waiting to see if the story runs. If it does, the recordings become supporting material. The room was very quiet. Amara understood now, fully, completely, without any remaining area of softness, the shape of what had been built around her. Not around Kim, around her. She was the specific vulnerability, the human detail that made the story personal, rather than financial, the face you could put on something abstract. She was the point of entry. She picked up the folder, closed it, set it back on the table. I want to talk to Caroline Stearns myself, she said. The room shifted, not physically, but the air changed quality. That's not advisable, David Cho started. I know it's not advisable, Amara said. I want to do it anyway. She looked at Helena. You do crisis communications. You know that the most powerful counter-narrative isn't a press release. It's a person. She held Helena's gaze. Put me in front of her. Let me talk. Helena studied her. The professional assessment was visible, the rapid internal calculation. What would you say? The truth, Amara said. Everything. My brother's case, my employment history, how I ended up in this household, what I actually do here, what Minjan is, what this family is to me, all of it, without filtering it through a statement prepared by legal. She glanced at David Cho. No offense. Some taken, he said dryly, and I need to be clear that this would expose you to, I know what it exposes me to. Her voice was steady. She felt the steadiness in it and identified it accurately. It wasn't calm. It was the thing that comes after calm has run out, and you're just left with decision. I've been managing my exposure my whole life. I've been careful and strategic and appropriate and small, and I still ended up in a folder on that table. She looked at Kim. You said moving first was the strategy. That's what I'm saying. I move first. As myself. Not as a subject in someone else's story. Kim looked at her. Long enough. And with enough of that particular quality of attention that the room felt the weight of it. It's your decision? He said. Entirely. I know, she said. Which was, she realized, exactly the right thing for him to say, and a thing she hadn't known she needed to hear until he said it. Helena looked at her watch. Stearns is planning to contact Kim's PR for comment by end of business today, which means she's likely close to a publication date. She looked at Amara. If we're doing this, we need to move in the next 3 hours. Then let's move, Amara said. What happened in the next 3 hours was controlled chaos of a very specific professional variety. Helena made calls from the hallway. David Cho drafted a framework of legally safe disclosures. Kim disappeared into his own set of calls that Amara didn't have access to and didn't ask about. She was put at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and told to write, in her own words, a timeline of her relationship with the Jong household. Not a formal statement, Helena specified. Something human, something in her own voice. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. Her handwriting got messier as she went, which was how she knew she was getting to the real things rather than the managed things. She wrote about the interview, about the first week with Minjun, how she'd found him sitting alone in the garden at 6 in the morning because no one had thought to tell her he was an early riser. She wrote about the medications and the routines and the model of the solar system. She wrote about Marcus, all of it, the week he'd called her from the police station, and the months after that had tested the structural integrity of the relationship they'd rebuilt since their mother died. She wrote about money, how much she made, how she spent it, the $342 dress. She wrote about last night, every second of it that she remembered, in sequence, without editorializing. She put the pen down. Her hand ached. Helena appeared. Read the pages standing up. Her face went through several expressions that she mostly succeeded in controlling. "This is good," she said finally. "This is very good." She looked at Amara. "Are you sure?" "Call Stearns," Amara said. Caroline Stearns was not what Amara had pictured. She'd assembled an image from the name and the title, staff writer, Metropolitan Examiner, that tended toward a certain type, the aggressive, forward-lean type, the type that wore their skepticism visibly. Instead, the woman who arrived at the neutral location Helena had arranged, a conference room in a downtown law office, was compact and quiet, and had the specific patience of someone who had learned that silence made people fill space in useful ways. She was 38, maybe 40. She had a small recorder she placed on the table, and a notebook she didn't open, and eyes that moved the way Kim's moved, recording, not reacting. She looked at Amara and said, "Thank you for meeting with me." "Thank you for agreeing to," Amara said. Helena was in the room. One of David Cho's associates was in the room. Caroline Stearns had her own person, an editor, introduced only as Mark. "I want to be transparent about where the piece is," Caroline said. "We're close to publication. The main argument is structured and the financial documentation is solid. What brought me here today is your name, specifically, and the sourcing around you. I have one source making characterizations about your role in the Jong household that I haven't been able to independently verify." "What does the source characterize?" Amara said. "That you were placed in the household through a facilitated arrangement connected to your brother's legal situation and Kim Jong's organization." Caroline said it without inflection, which was its own form of professionalism, and that your role is not primarily caregiving. Amara looked at her steadily. "The source is lying." "Tell me why." So Amara told her. She didn't use Helena's framework. She didn't use the legally safe disclosure language. She used what she'd written on the yellow legal pad, the actual sequence of events in the actual order they'd occurred, and she spoke in the same way she'd written it, without managing the sound of it, without performing composure. She told Caroline Stearns about the interview and the garden at 6 in the morning and Marcus's phone call from the police station, and she let the texture of all of it stay in her voice. Caroline didn't interrupt. She didn't write in her notebook. She let the recorder do its work, and she watched Amara with those patient, recording eyes. When Amara finished, the room was quiet. Then Caroline said, "Why did Kim Jong pull out of the Aluldrin deal?" "You'd need to ask him," Amara said. "I'm asking you." "I know what you know," Amara said. "I read the ethics review, the same document you probably have access to through your own reporting. Pattern of behavior, discrimination complaints, vendor exclusion practices. The business relationship failed on character grounds." She paused. "What happened to me at the gala was consistent with the documented pattern. It was the most recent example. It wasn't the cause." Caroline was very still. "You're saying the decision was already made." "I'm saying I'm not the reason an $800 million deal collapsed. I'm a caregiver. I take care of a sick child. What I am is not what this story is about. and whoever told you otherwise was using me as a way into a story about something else. Something moved in Caroline's face. Not warmth exactly. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of a journalist who has just heard the cleanest version of a thing they already partly knew. Your source, Amara said, has a financial interest in damaging Kim Jong's reputation before a restructured deal can be completed. Whatever they gave you about me, the timing, the characterization, it serves that interest. She kept her eyes on Caroline's. I'm not asking you to kill the story. I'm asking you to be accurate. Those are different requests. Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Mark. A communication passed between them that didn't require words. I'll need to go back to the sourcing, Caroline said carefully. Some of what you've described changes the context of certain documents we were provided. Were provided, Helena said from her chair, and let those two words do their work. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Handshakes, professional, nothing conclusive said. The elevator ride down was quiet. In the lobby, Helena put her hand briefly on Amar's arm, not warm, not cold, just present, and said, "That was either very smart or very brave." "Can it be both?" Amara said. "In my experience, rarely," Helena said. "But sometimes." Outside, the city was doing its afternoon thing. The volume of it. The compressed urgency of people moving between obligations. Amara stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold air come in through her mouth and out through her nose and tried to locate her own center of gravity. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She looked at it. "You should have stayed out of it, Ms. Bellamy. Now you've made yourself the story. We both know what happens to people who make themselves the story." She read it twice, screenshotted it, sent the screenshot to Helena without comment. Then she stood on the sidewalk in the cold with traffic moving past her, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, exactly. Though fear was present, she was honest enough to acknowledge that. She felt something underneath the fear that was older and more structural. The thing that had been there through 15 years of making herself small, through every carefully managed exit from every room where she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. It was anger, real anger. Not the hot reactive kind that burns fast and leaves nothing. The other kind. The kind that has mass to it. The kind that has been compressed over years into something dense and navigable. The kind you can actually move with. She put her phone in her bag. She looked at the street. She thought about Minjin in his room watching galaxies move away from each other at incomprehensible speeds. And she thought about Kim at his window with whatever calculations were moving behind those controlled eyes. And she thought about a green dress hanging in a closet for 11 weeks. She thought about Victoria Aluldrin's smile. The engineering of it, the way it had stayed in place regardless of what it was doing. She walked back toward the parking structure. Her heels hit the sidewalk with a sound that felt deliberate, that felt chosen. Her phone rang. "Kim," she answered. "I'm outside." "I know," he said. "There's something you need to see. Come back to the house." A pause. "Amara." "Yeah." "What you did in there." He stopped, which was unusual, which was therefore significant. "Come back to the house." She got in the car. She drove. 40 minutes later, she was back in the Jong residence, back in the study, and the room was configured differently again. David Cho was on a call in the corner. Helena was at the desk with 3 devices going simultaneously. Hyun was standing near the door with the expression that meant the situation had escalated past the parameters it had been in when she left. On the desk, in the center, was a printed document. New. She hadn't seen it before. Kim picked it up and held it toward her, and she took it. She looked at it. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. It was a signed statement, notarized, dated 6 hours ago. She didn't recognize the name at the top. A name she'd never heard. A woman. Someone who'd apparently worked in Charles Aluldrin's organization for 7 years before leaving under circumstances described in the statement with the kind of specific procedural detail that is very hard to fabricate. The statement described, in granular sequence, a series of conversations between Raymond Park and Charles Aluldrin over the past 4 months. It described the specific instruction Park had been given to find a human angle on Kim Jong's household that could be used. It described the moment 6 weeks ago when Amar's brother's cleared charge had appeared in a background search, and the conversation in which Charles Aluldrin had said, with apparent satisfaction, "That'll do." It was dated 6 hours ago. She'd been at the gala 6 hours ago. She'd been sitting with Minjun playing war 6 hours ago. She looked up at Kim. "Who is she?" she said, meaning the woman who'd signed the statement. "Former Director of Compliance at Aluldrin Development," Kim said. "She left the company 8 months ago under what they characterized as a restructuring. She's had this information since before she left." "Why come forward now?" Kim looked at her with an expression she still didn't entirely know how to read. "Because I called Charles Aluldrin this morning and told him the story could stop where it was, or it could continue to a place that was much worse for his family than losing one partnership." He paused. "He chose wrong." Amara set the statement down. She looked at the desk, at Helena working her 3 devices, at David Cho in the corner, at Hyun near the door. "This isn't over," she said. "No," Kim said. "Charles isn't going to let this go because a former employee came forward. No. And Victoria sent me a threat 20 minutes ago from an unknown number." The room went completely still. Kim looked at her. "Show me." She took out her phone, found the screenshot she'd sent Helena, held the screen toward him. He looked at it for 5 seconds. His face did nothing. His eyes did something that she felt in the base of her spine. He looked at Hyun. He said 2 words in Korean that she didn't understand. Hyun left the room immediately. Kim looked back at Amara. He said, very quietly, "You're going to stay here tonight." "Kim, that's not a request." He said it without heat, without volume, just the weight of it. "Your apartment is not safe right now. You stay here, Minjun is here, you know the security layout. We handle this from here." She opened her mouth to argue, because arguing was the right instinct, because the combination of autonomy and the specific warm, dangerous feeling of being the person someone wanted to protect was a combination she had exactly 0 practice navigating, and it made her want to push back purely on principle. She didn't argue. "Okay," she said, and that single word, that single compact capitulation to the specific reality of her situation opened a door she hadn't known she was standing in front of. Because the moment she said it, the moment she stopped managing the distance between herself and what was actually happening, she felt the full weight of the last 24 hours land on her at once. The ballroom, the card, the phone call, the folder with her name in it, the yellow legal pad, Caroline Stearns' patient recording eyes, the sidewalk, the text message, the statement on the desk, all of it at once with nothing left to absorb it. Her hands were shaking, small tremors, barely visible, but there. Kim saw them. Of course he saw them. He crossed to the other side of the desk and he didn't touch her because he understood. She understood that he understood. That touch was not what was needed. Instead, he simply stopped close enough that the space she was in became shared, and he said, quietly, "You don't have to hold everything at once." She looked at him. "Put some of it down," he said. "Just for tonight. We carry the rest tomorrow." Her throat tightened. She was not going to cry in front of him. That was a line she'd drawn, and she was going to hold it. She looked at the ceiling, breathed in, breathed out. From somewhere upstairs, faint through the floors, she could hear Minjun's documentary. The narrator's voice, inaudible at this distance, just the cadence of it. The patient explanation of something very large and very old. She lowered her gaze, set her jaw, looked at Kim Jong with all the armor she had left and said, "Tell me what comes next." He held her gaze. "Charles Aluldrin is going to make one more move," he said, "tonight, before he understands how much ground he's already lost." He picked up the notarized statement. "When he does, we need to be ready." He looked at her directly, without softening it. "And Amara, when he moves, he's not coming for me. He's made a calculation that you're the softer target." She held his gaze. "He's wrong," she said. Kim almost smiled. The smallest possible version of a smile, barely there, but present. "Yes," he said. And then his phone rang again, and by the way his face shifted in the first half second before he controlled it, she knew. with the bone-level certainty she'd been developing for 2 years in this household that Charles Aluldren had just made his move. Kim looked at his phone for exactly 3 seconds. Then he set it face down on the desk, which was something she had never seen him do. He always answered, or he stepped out, or he handed the device to Hyun. He had never once in 2 years simply set it down. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. "Caroline Stern's just published." The room went very still. Helena looked up from her 3 devices. David Cho's call stopped mid-sentence. "That's not possible," Helena said. "She said end of business for comment. We had until—" "She moved the timeline," Kim said. His voice was the same quality it always was. Amara had stopped finding that quality reassuring. Now she recognized it for what it was. Not calm, not control, but the practiced containment of a man who had spent decades making sure nothing he felt was ever the first thing a room knew about. Helena was already on her phone. David Cho was moving toward the desk. Amara stood exactly where she was and felt something happen in her chest that was not panic, was adjacent to panic, was the thing that lives one room over from panic and shares a wall with it. "Pull it up," she said. Helena turned one of her devices toward Amara, the Metropolitan Examiner's website. The piece was at the top of the page. The headline read, "The Zhong Empire and the Human Cost of Power, Inside a City's Most Dangerous Business Relationship." Below the headline, a subhead that read, "Sources reveal a pattern of pressure, retaliation, and the unlikely woman at the center of it all." Amara read fast. She had always read fast. It was one of the things about herself she'd been grateful for in moments where fast mattered. The financial architecture of Kim's organization, the city officials, the land deals. She read that section, and it was thorough, and it was damaging in the specific way that accurate contextualized information is damaging when the context has been carefully selected. But it was not what she'd feared. It was not what Park had been building. She found her name 8 paragraphs in. She read the paragraph, then the next, then the next. She straightened up. She looked at Helena. "She pulled the household angle," Amara said. Helena read it herself. Her face shifted slightly. "She used the gala incident, the ballroom, the Aluldren confrontation." She scrolled. "But she positioned you as... She framed you as..." She stopped. "Read it out loud," Amara said. Helena read, "Sources close to the Zhong household describe Amara Bellamy, a private caregiver employed by Zhong for 2 years, not as a peripheral figure, but as a stabilizing presence in a household that has otherwise struggled with consistency. Multiple sources independently characterized her as someone who, in the words of one, made the house feel like a house. Her presence at the Meridian Gala and the subsequent confrontation with Victoria Aluldren appears to have been a catalyst not because of what Miss Bellamy did, but because of what was done to her and who was watching when it happened." The room was quiet. Amara read it again over Helena's shoulder. "She flipped it," David Cho said. "She went back to the sourcing," Helena said slowly. "Whatever Park gave her, she went back and she's a good journalist," Amara said, flatly. Just the fact of it. Kim picked his phone back up. He was reading the piece himself now, scrolling, and she watched his face work through it in the way his face worked through everything. Nearly nothing showing, but the nearly was important. The nearly was where you found what was actually happening. "The financial section is accurate," he said finally. "Kim," David Cho started. "Most of it is accurate," Kim said. He looked at his attorney without apology. "We knew this was the piece. We knew this version existed. We prepared for worse." He set the phone down again. "This we can manage." "The city officials named in the piece are going to call within the hour," David Cho said. "I know. 3 of them are in active contract relationships with—" "I know," Kim said, more quietly, which was the version of his voice that meant the subject was closed. He looked at Amara. "Are you in it in a way that harms you?" She considered the paragraph she'd heard Helena read, the characterization of her, the word stabilizing, the word catalyst. The phrase made the house feel like a house, which someone had said about her and which When she heard it read aloud in a law office conference room through Helena's precise professional voice, had done something to the back of her throat that she hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. "No," she said, "not the way Park intended." Kim nodded. He looked at Hyun. "Get Charles Aluldren on the phone." Hyun was already moving. What happened next happened fast and then slow, the way real crises always moved. The acute phase burning through its fuel at speed, and then the aftermath, which was its own kind of difficulty. Charles Aluldren did not take the call. Raymond Park did. Hyun handed Kim the phone, and Kim listened for 40 seconds without speaking and then said very quietly, "Tell Charles that the compliance officer's statement is currently with 3 additional journalists and will be released to all of them simultaneously if I don't speak to him directly within the next 30 minutes. He paused. "And tell him I said hello." He handed the phone back to Hyun. 11 minutes later, Charles Aluldren called. Kim took it in the study with David Cho and asked Amara to wait in the hallway. She waited. She sat on the same bench she'd sat on that morning after hearing Kim's voice change through the door, and she put her hands on her knees and looked at the floor and breathed. Through the closed door, she could hear Kim's voice, but not the words. The tone of it was even, measured, and entirely without mercy. Not threatening. She'd learned the difference. Threatening was for people you needed to frighten. This was different. This was the voice of someone speaking to a person who had already lost, who simply hadn't received confirmation yet, and who was being walked through the details of their loss by someone who had no particular feeling about it either way. After 23 minutes, the voice stopped. After 25 minutes, the door opened. Kim came out. He looked at her on the bench and said, "Charles Aluldren will be issuing a statement tomorrow morning accepting full responsibility for the campaign against this household. Raymond Park is being referred to the state bar for ethics violations. Caroline Stearns will receive a statement from the compliance officer with documentation by end of tonight." Amara looked at him. "And Victoria?" A pause. The first real pause she'd heard from him in hours. "Victoria is Charles's problem now," he said. "That marriage is not going to survive the week." She looked at the floor. She thought about Victoria Aluldren's engineered smile, the way it had stayed in place while the words came out from underneath it, and she tried to find satisfaction in what Kim had just described, and found instead something more complicated, something that was almost, and she recognized this with some discomfort, almost sympathy, not for the cruelty, for the smallness of a person who needed cruelty to feel large. She understood smallness. She'd practiced it herself for 15 years, just in the other direction. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing," Kim said. She waited. "The piece is going to generate attention, not all of it welcome." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand was the closest he came to tenderness, not softness, not warmth, but the specific quality of not looking away from someone when you're telling them something that costs them something. "Your name is in a significant investigative piece about my organization. That follows you. I want to be clear that I understand what that means for you and that I—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't take that lightly." She looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know, when you hired me, did you know that being connected to your household would eventually cost me something?" He held her gaze. "I knew it was possible. And you hired me anyway. I hired you because Minjun needed you," he said, "and because I interviewed 11 people before you and none of them looked at him the way you did. And I told myself the possible cost was a future problem." He paused. "I was wrong to do that, to make that choice without telling you it existed." It was the most straightforward acknowledgement of fault she had ever heard from him, and the weight of it in the quiet hallway was significant. She sat with it. "I would have taken the job anyway," she said finally. It was true. She'd known it while she said it, and she'd known it before, in the back of something she hadn't been calling by its name. He said nothing, but something in his posture changed in a way that was nearly imperceptible and entirely real. "I'm going to go check on Minjun," she said. She went. Minjun was asleep. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't registered the time building toward that. He was in his bed in the dark room with one hand under his cheek, and his breathing was slow and even, and the rough edge of the congestion was lighter than it had been even that morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating at the edge of their capacity for many hours and has only just been given permission to feel it. She went to the chair in the corner of his room, the one she'd moved there 2 weeks ago because she'd been staying late during the worst of his chest infection. And she sat down and she put her head back against the wall and she closed her eyes. She didn't intend to sleep. She slept anyway. The deep, total sleep of someone whose system has finally stopped holding everything up by force of will. She woke to pale light and the sound of Minjun's breathing and a blanket across her lap that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Wool, dark gray. She touched the edge of it for a moment and thought about the hands that had put it there and didn't examine the thought too carefully, because some things were better understood in pieces over time than all at once in an early morning. She looked at Minjun, still asleep. The light from the window suggested 7, maybe 7:30. She got up carefully, folded the blanket, left it on the chair. She washed her face in the bathroom down the hall, assessed herself in the mirror with the unsentimental attention she gave to most things, and went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something being cooked that involved sesame and green onion. Mrs. Park was at the stove in her practiced, economical way, not turning around when Amara came in. "Coffee's ready," Mrs. Park said. Amara poured a cup, sat at the kitchen table. The morning light was the winter kind, thin, white, honest about the cold without being dramatic about it. Her phone had 14 notifications. She looked at them methodically. Deja had called twice and texted 4 times, the most recent message reading, "Call me, call me, call me. The pieces everywhere, are you okay? Call me." Helena had sent a summary update at 4 in the morning. The compliance officer's full statement had been picked up by 2 additional outlets. Charles Aluldrin's PR team had requested a 48-hour window before his statement, which David Cho had compressed to 18 hours. 3 people from Amara's past, former colleagues, someone from her certification program years ago, had sent messages that were variations of the same thing, which was a version of, "I saw your name, I'm thinking of you." She read them all. She didn't respond to any of them yet. She drank her coffee. She was on her second cup when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavier than Minjun's, deliberate in their pace, and then Kim was in the kitchen doorway in dark clothes, jacket not yet on, looking like a man who had either slept for 4 hours or not at all. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Coffee," Mrs. Park said without turning around. Kim poured a cup. He sat across the table from Amara. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which was not uncomfortable the way silences between people often were, but had instead the quality of a silence that had been earned. "Charles's statement drops at 9, Kim said finally. His PR team negotiated down from 18 hours to 14. "Is it what you wanted?" "It's more than I expected." He set his cup down. Park's bar referral is filed. Stearns followed up with a second piece overnight tying Park's sourcing directly to the Aluldrin retaliation campaign. "The narrative is clean." She nodded. "And me?" "You come out of it as someone who spoke truthfully to a journalist under significant pressure," he said. "That's not a bad position to be in." She almost smiled. High praise. "It's an accurate assessment." She looked at her coffee cup. "My brother is going to call?" "Yes." "He's going to be upset that his name was anywhere near this." "He has that right." "And I'm going to have to explain everything to him." She looked up. "Including who I work for and what working for you has turned into." Kim met her eyes. "Also accurate." "He won't like it." "Probably not." She picked up her cup. "You're not going to offer to smooth that over somehow, make a call, have someone talk to him, clear the path?" Kim looked at her steadily. "That's not my relationship to manage," he said. "That's yours." She held on to that for a moment, the weight and the relief of it, the fact that he understood the difference. "Okay," she said. Then, "What happens now? With the household, with—" She moved her hand slightly, a gesture that was meant to encompass the thing between them that they hadn't named, the complicated geography of last night and the blanket in the chair and 2 years of building something without calling it by what it was. Kim looked at his coffee cup. She had rarely seen him look at anything other than a person when he was thinking. The fact that he looked at his coffee cup told her more than the look itself. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "in the capacity you've been in, with Minjun." He looked back up. "And I'd like, when you're ready, if you're ready, to be honest about what else is here." He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without apology for the plainness of it. "I'm not asking for a decision now. I'm telling you what's true so you have complete information." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the thin morning light, with Mrs. Park at the stove making something that smelled like breakfast and Minjun asleep upstairs, and 14 notifications on her phone and a blanket folded on a chair. And she understood with the full-body clarity of someone who has spent 24 hours being stripped of every managed defense she'd built over 15 years, that she was at a genuine crossroads of a kind she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned for. She could stand up and leave. Professionally, cleanly, she could give notice, she could remove herself from the story and the household and the complicated, dangerous warmth of being seen by someone like Kim Jong. She could go back to the careful life, the managed life, the life that fit within the space she'd been given. Or she could stay. Not because she was rescued, not because power had made room for her as an act of charity, but because she had walked into a ballroom on a wrong turn and someone had watched her walk out of it with her chin up and her hands still, and had understood what that cost, and had never once asked her to be less than she was. She thought about the dress. $342. 11 weeks in the closet. The first time she'd worn it somewhere real, she'd been humiliated in front of 400 people. The second time she'd worn it, she'd sat in front of a journalist and told the truth until the journalist believed her. She thought that was probably the right arc for a $342 dress. "I'm staying," she said, "with Minjun." She looked at Kim directly. "The other thing. I need time." "You have it," he said immediately. "No negotiation, no pressure." She nodded. From upstairs, footsteps, small ones. Minjun's particular morning rhythm. A pause at the bathroom, then the shuffle towards stairs. They both heard it. Something happened on Kim's face that was only visible because Amara had spent 2 years learning to see it. A softening so brief it was almost not there. The face of a man who built his empire on controlled distance and had, in this kitchen, in this light, let a small amount of the distance close. Minjun appeared in the doorway in his pajamas with his hair sideways, looked at both of them at the table, and said with complete 8-year-old directness, "Why are you both here so early?" "I stayed the night," Amara said. He absorbed that, looked at his father, looked at Amara. Some calculation moved through those serious eyes. "Okay," he said, and went to the cabinet and got out the box of cereal he was only allowed on weekends, looked at his father, and his father said nothing, so he poured it. He sat at the table between them. He ate his cereal. Outside, the thin winter light was getting slightly stronger, moving from white towards something warmer. Amara picked up her phone. She called Deja. Deja answered on the first ring. "Oh, thank God, are you?" "I'm okay," Amara said. "I'm at the house. I'll explain everything. But I'm okay." She paused. "Can you meet me tonight? Bring Marcus." A beat. "Marcus is going to have a lot of questions." "I know, I have answers." She looked at the table, at Minjun's cereal, at Kim's coffee cup. "I have all of them now." The week that followed was not easy. Nothing that happened that week was easy, and Amara would have been suspicious of it if it had been, because she'd lived enough life to know that things that resolve cleanly were things that hadn't actually resolved. Charles Aloldran's statement ran at 9 on a Tuesday morning, and it was everything David Cho had required it to be. Full acknowledgement, professional culpability, no attempt to distribute blame. Victoria was not mentioned in the statement, which was its own information. By Thursday, 2 separate sources had confirmed to Amara through Helena, who apparently stayed in the game even after her immediate engagement ended because she found the situation professionally interesting, that the Alodrans had separated. Not legally. Not yet. But Charles had moved to their apartment in the financial district, and Victoria had stayed in the house, and the people who moved in their circles had felt the seismic shift of it and were, in the careful way of their world, adjusting their positions accordingly. Raymond Park's bar referral moved through the early stages of process the way those things moved, slowly, with the grinding institutional patience of bodies that exist to be thorough rather than fast. David Cho said it would take months. He also said the outcome was not in significant doubt, which was the most optimistic thing she'd ever heard David Cho say about anything. Caroline Stern's follow-up piece ran on Wednesday and was longer and more careful and more damaging to the Aluldran organization's reputation than the first one. Amara read it at her own kitchen table, back in her own apartment, in the clothes she'd changed into the night before when Lee had finally driven her home. She read it with her second cup of coffee and her sister's voice in her head from the long dinner they'd had on Tuesday, and Marcus across the table being exactly as upset as she'd predicted, and exactly as real about it as she'd hoped, which was the thing about Marcus. He had never once in his life performed an emotion. When he was angry, he was actually angry, and when he came around, he actually came around, and the arc of that dinner had moved through both of those things in a way that left her feeling afterward like something that had been slightly out of alignment for a long time had been quietly corrected. She went back to work on Thursday. Minjun's chest had cleared almost completely by then. The rough edge was gone. He breathed like a person who had forgotten he'd ever been sick, which was the resilience of childhood, the way it metabolized difficulty and moved on. He was at his desk when she arrived, working on a school project, surrounded by papers and markers, and the focus disorder that meant he was actually engaged, and not just performing engagement for the benefit of adults. He looked up when she came in, assessed her the way he always did. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," she said. "But better than yesterday?" She looked at him. "How would you know what I looked like yesterday? I wasn't here yesterday." "Dad said you'd probably look tired, but better." He went back to his paper. He was right. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, holding that piece of information, turning it over. Then she came in and sat on the edge of his desk the way she always did, and she looked at his project, which appeared to be a diagram of ocean currents and their relationship to surface temperature, and she said, "Tell me about this." He told her. He talked about ocean currents for 20 minutes with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of a person who had not yet learned that caring deeply about things left you vulnerable. And she listened with the same quality of attention she always brought. And at some point during the explanation of the thermohaline circulation, she felt something in her chest settle, in a way that she recognized as the specific sensation of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She didn't know what to call what her life had become. It was not what she'd planned. It was not safe, or simple, or the careful small things she'd managed for so long. It was complicated, and it had a shape she hadn't chosen, and there were parts of it she was still navigating and would be for a long time. But it was real. All of it was real. The difficulty and the warmth and the thing between her and Kim that they were moving towards slowly, in the honest way of people who had both learned that speed cost you accuracy. The relationship with Deja and Marcus that had survived a crisis and come out with less performance and more truth in it. The fact that her name was in a published piece and the piece had not destroyed her. The fact that she had sat in front of a journalist and told the truth. And the truth had been enough. And Minjun, talking about ocean currents with his hands moving and his eyes bright, who needed her not because she was what was available, but because she was what was right for him, which was a different thing, a better thing. A thing she had spent 2 years earning and would spend more years continuing to earn. 3 weeks after this gala, on a Saturday morning when the winter had softened slightly into something that wasn't yet spring but was considering it, Amara opened her closet to get a sweater and saw the emerald dress at the back. She stood there for a moment. $342. The boutique on Clement Street between the dry cleaner and the dim someplace. She took it off the hanger. She laid it on the bed and looked at it in the morning light. Dark green against white sheets, the silk moving slightly in the air from the open window. She thought about the fitting room mirror, the first time she'd worn it, the second time, what it had cost her and what it had returned. She hung it back up, not at the back, near the front where she'd see it. She got her sweater. She went to make coffee. On the kitchen table were 2 things. Her phone, with a message from Kim that read, simply, "Minjun has a school thing at 2. He wants you there if you're free." And beside it, folded once, The gray wool blanket that she'd brought home from the Zhang residence in her bag without entirely meaning to, and which she'd put on the kitchen table without entirely knowing why, and which she looked at now with the uncategorizable feeling of a person who has stopped managing their own heart and started simply listening to it. She picked up her phone. She typed back, "I'll be there." She put the coffee on. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent, relentless, full of rooms and stories and 100,000 people navigating the distance between who they'd allowed themselves to be and who they actually were. She had spent 15 years in that distance, making herself small enough to fit inside it. She was done with the distance now. She was going to take up the space she took up in whatever room she happened to walk into, whether she'd meant to walk into it or not. The coffee finished. She poured a cup. She stood at her kitchen window with the cup in both hands, looking at the morning, and she felt not happy exactly, because happiness was weather, and she'd stopped trusting weather. She felt solid, continuous, like someone who had walked through a significant fire and come out the other side not unburned, because that was not how fire worked, but upright and moving forward, and still entirely herself. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand everything.